Good day to everyone. I want to
Goedendag iedereen
good afternoon.
en goedemiddag,
So good morning, good afternoon, good day to everyone
goedemorgen, goedendag, goedemiddag.
for joining this very important regional webinar on human
Merci.
security, human mobility, and multi-hazard early warning systems to achieve resilience in the Caribbean region. And you know, resilience building is a very important issue for us in OECS and the broader Caribbean region. And in fact, only a few months ago, with the passage of Hurricane Beryl, which impacted Grenadines, where we once again got the appreciation, if you like, of the kinds of impact that environmental hazards, particularly climate change-induced events, would have on economies and societies. And it is well recorded that major storms have significant impact on
On sait que les
economic
grandes catastrophes
activity,
ont un impact
economic growth,
important sur
and causing
la
significant
croissance économique
economic losses in
et
terms
nous.
of GDP losses. But we also know the other side of the coin is the social impact that these major disasters tend to have. We note, for instance, the loss of livelihoods that tends to follow major storms, and moreover, the loss of lives that these bring about. And somewhere in between, you have the issue of internal as well as cross-border displacement that these events tend to impact. But we also appreciate that the reality is such that we cannot change. And consequently, the idea of resilience building is fundamentally
Et donc l'idée de construire
the discussion that we should be having. Now, there are several activities and initiatives that have been advanced thus far. The UN Security Trust Joint Program is certainly one of those interventions led by IOM and supported by several international agencies as well. And even at the OECS Commission, we have been implementing several initiatives with several development partners towards enhancing capacity of border officials, for instance, to receive people who have been displaced across borders, supporting vulnerable communities to enhance the ability of these communities to respond to the impact of climate change, are among some of what we've been advancing in support of our member states' ability to be more resilient. And in that regard, we thank the development agencies that we've been working with to achieve these. Today's webinar is timely, is critical for us to explore further the issues around resilience building. And to do so, we have a very experienced, knowledgeable panel that have been put together to unpack the topic on human security, human mobility, and multi-hazard early warning systems to achieve resilience in the Caribbean region. In particular, Mrs. Viola Pascal, project coordinator of the International Organization for Migration, will seek to provide an overview on how the joint program has promoted a human security approach to disaster displacement, environmental migration, and disaster risk reduction in the Caribbean region. Following her presentation, we will hear from Ms. Kana Kudo, as well as Ms. Alana Lewis, who are going to explore further the whole issue of the application of a human security approach to strengthening resilience in vulnerable communities and to advance sustainable development. And of course, this webinar cannot be advanced in such a manner that we do not hear from our own member states and the experiences of these member states. And so to do so, we have Ms. Michelle Forbes and Mr. John Mussington, who will certainly give us an overview of the lessons learned from critical disasters, particularly the Hurricane Irma impact on Barbuda, and of course, the Hurricane Beryl impact on St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And let's not forget, all the impacts that we have from environmental hazards are not just climate-induced. We will also hear how St. Vincent responded effectively with respect to the La Soufrière volcanic eruption in 2021. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is by any means a summary of the webinar, but certainly it highlights critical issues that will come forth in this webinar. And to give us an overview of the human security, human mobility issues, particularly being advanced by the joint program, I now invite Ms. Pascal, who will kick off the discussion this morning, this afternoon, today for all of us. Ms. Pascal.
Yes, thank you for that, Dr. Henry, and I'll try to save on the time. Okay, my task is basically to give a brief overview of the Joint Human Security Project. And by way of a bit of a background on the project, in 2019, we had representatives from national governments, regional agencies, and international partners meeting in Trinidad and Tobago to discuss pathways to address human mobility challenges in the region. And this would have come right after the devastating impacts from the 2017 hurricane season, where we saw some countries, for example, Barbuda and Dominica, devastated by hurricanes Irma and Maria, respectively. From this multi-stakeholder deliberation, one of the recommendations was to develop a regional perspective for emergency evacuation processes while leveraging the free movement arrangements in the region. The Joint Human Security Project basically came out of this scenario to answer some of the recommendations that were put forward from this meeting. The program began in 2021. We had 2 phases of the program, and we are now on the second phase. And we're basically looking at promoting a human security approach to disaster displacement and environmental migration. The 2 key outputs from this program are to enhance systems and capacities for disaster risk management that support adaptation to climate change and environmental degradation, on human mobility, all through the human security perspective. And another outcome that is key to human security is to raise awareness on the value of the human security approach in addressing issues relating to human mobility and climate change in the Caribbean region. Now, the partners under this program, of course, the United Nations Trust Fund for Human Security are the donors for this program, the Barbados Resident Coordinator's Office, IOM, UNDRR, CDMA, the OECS Commission, and of course, the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Under phase 1 of the program, we had 9 beneficiary countries. Under the second phase, we now have 12 countries being joined by Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago. What have we achieved so far under this project in terms of addressing human mobility, human security challenges, all relating to climate change and disasters? We have created several products under the program to support the disaster community, immigration, border officials, and foreign affairs officers, all these key stakeholders involved in the evacuation process. One of the areas that we needed to look at initially was how national frameworks are addressing human mobility and human security. And we had to develop what we call the Environmental Migration, Disaster Displacement, and Human Security Policy Assessment Tool. And the purpose of this tool was basically to analyze these documents to see how the national frameworks have addressed any of these thematic areas. And from the application of the assessment tool, we would have developed what we call assessment reports for each country. So we would have put forward what the conditions were and provide recommendations going forward as to how these countries could go about integrating human mobility and human security in their national framework. We also provided under this program what we call a compendium of best practices, where we collated from across the Caribbean region conditions or needs that were expressed by persons who were displaced due to various weather systems or volcanic eruption. What were their expressed needs in terms of need for education for children, access to documentation, livelihood support, durable solutions, and so on. And we have provided a compendium of all of these needs and how various governments went about addressing these needs. And these can provide guidance to disaster operatives moving forward. We also provided the cross-border evacuation protocol, and this was a direct request coming out of that initial meeting that I mentioned in 2019. So while participating states of CDMA will have various evacuation plans, they may not have yet considered how can we manage mass cross-border evacuation to neighboring islands. And this is where this cross-border evacuation document comes in quite handy, and national governments can now adapt this document to their specific context to ensure that we are catering to the needs of the very vulnerable, and we are ensuring that their needs are met, taking into consideration all the threats to their human security. Another key achievement under the program, which we are extremely proud of, is the 13-point OECS Ministerial Declaration that was signed off on in 2023 by OECS governments. And this is just a commitment by OECS governments to tackle human mobility due to climate change. And this is built on, working with partners from the banking sector, governments, education. All key partners will be involved in this process. Sorry, moving to the next slide. Importantly, the next step for this OECS declaration is that we're looking at developing a working group as well as a plan of action for the implementation of this OECS Ministerial Declaration. And we will be reaching out to all the key partners that are here on this call. So it's quite important that you are aware of the existence of this declaration and how your operation fits into this declaration as we look forward to the implementation of moving forward. And finally, what was also important under the project is the mainstreaming and sustainability of human security, as well as the products that were developed under the project. And we thought that working with CDMA on this was quite critical because CDMA works closely with national governments. And this is one way in which you could gain some entry point in terms of mainstreaming human mobility in the national disaster plans of participating countries. So we have been working closely with UNDRR on this initiative to see how we could integrate human mobility within the comprehensive disaster management strategy of CDMA, which is currently under review. And from there, we have also begun working with some of the Caribbean, the participating states. We have already been in discussion with them to see how they can integrate human mobility and human security in their respective country work programs. So we'll be hearing more about this as we move forward and working with the additional countries. And as we wrap up this brief introduction, what would I like you to take away from this session? We want you to think more keenly about human mobility. And when we speak about human mobility, we are speaking about displacement, which is forced movement, migration, which is more on a voluntary basis, and planned relocation, where you may need to move an entire community, a last resort, of course. And these are usually often driven by disasters. Human security threats increase for displaced people who are vulnerable, not only to impending hazards, but they may experience limitations to protection and empowerment initiatives. So we want you to think through the lens of human security, and this could help UN agencies, governments, and other partners to address the needs of vulnerable people in a more holistic manner and to better ensure that we leave no one behind. And this is where I end for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Pascal, for so efficiently giving this overview of this very important project. And certainly, I do appreciate the takeaways that you would have highlighted. Certainly, you've made my job a lot easier. But I think what is important to note too is the fundamental importance of the role of all agents in supporting the resilient building that we're talking about. So it's not just the role of international agencies and national governments, but it's also even within member states, within countries, for one to give consideration to the roles that different agencies play. And so we are much pleased with some of the products of this program. Certainly the whole issue around having protocols for cross-border movement is critical. We saw the impact of Hurricane Maria in 2017 and how it led to large migration of our people in Dominica to several parts of the OECS and wider CARICOM. And certainly the need for cross-border protocols critical. But again, on the other hand, the agencies in each member state, like Immigration Department and Customs, and other important agencies that supports the border controls and security are also critical in that process, because they're the ones who now have to use those tools effectively to make maximum use of it. And certainly I'll say one more point before I do invite Ms. Kudo to make her presentation. And so Ms. Kudo can perhaps start by uploading a PowerPoint presentation, because I'm coming to you shortly. The whole issue of the ministerial declaration highlights the importance of high-level political action to ensure that we have the sort of traction that is required to address resilience building. And having been deeply involved in the approval of the 13 actions that the ministerial declaration highlights, we do really look forward for greater collaboration with agencies to see through the implementation of those 13 actions. So with that said, thank you again, Mrs. Pascal. We certainly will return to you in a bit, and I'm sure there might be some quite interesting questions that will come your way. So I think, Ms. Lewis, you're in the hot seat instead, but I'm sure the seat is not so hot. Although the climate is quite hot and not as cold as it normally is during this time of year. And I guess that's climate change again that we're talking about. So Miss Lewis, who is a technical consultant at the Caribbean United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, will be presenting on the mainstreaming human security, introduction to making cities resilient in 2030. Quite interesting topic. So, Ms. Lewis, without further ado, I want to pass on the floor to you. And you have 10 minutes to give us a good overview. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. Thankfully, the seat is not too hot at this time, but sometimes it is. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to speak to you a little bit today on UNDRR's Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative, better known as MCR 2030. Jael, can you? Yes, please. But before we go into MCR 2030, I thought it good to bring home some numbers for us. And these numbers were extracted from the IMF between 1950 and 2016. And for the Caribbean region, they've identified that there were 324 disasters. And when we say disasters, in this case, they were those arising from naturally occurring hazards. So it doesn't take into consideration the technological, like the oil spills and the major accidents, etc. $22 billion in losses, economic losses to countries that could have otherwise gone towards investing in healthcare, investing in social protection, in education, and so on. And 250,000 lives lost to the period of 2016. And those lives lost, as you can imagine, does not also include COVID-19, which occurred after. And we are seeing more and more how systemic and interconnected risks are. And COVID-19 was a strong example of that, being a biological hazard with rippling effects across sectors, to livelihoods, to lives, and to the economy. And we also see that with climate change. Climate change is not only exacerbating existing risks, but it's also creating new hazards and exacerbating those underlying drivers of risk, such as poverty and inequality. In fact, the World Bank identifies that by 2050, they project some 17 million persons will need to move because of climate change in search of better livelihoods, but also in search of basic services and structures. What this means also is that we need deliberate action, urgent action, to minimize and prevent disaster risk where we can, to ensure that we protect people, their safety, their well-being, but also their livelihoods and the assets they rely on to live comfortably and well. As some of you may know, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction identifies 4 priority areas for action. And under those 4 priority areas, there are those actions that can be taken at the global level and at national and local levels. The Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative responds to that increasing need for resilience building at the local level, and so supports the Sendai Framework implementation in this way. It's a cross-stakeholder initiative that promotes knowledge sharing, advocacy, city-to-city learning, partnerships, but also MCR 2030 traditionally targets local governments. And when we say city, we know a city can mean different things depending on areas. And that's why sometimes we say, just go local. It can mean a district, it can mean a parish, a municipality, or whatever is that local area that needs and warrants that localized planning. And ultimately, MCR 2030 supports local areas in developing and implementing their local resilience action plans. When we say a resilient city or resilient locality, this too can mean different things depending on which area. But we found some terms to be consistent. For example, it's one that's safe. It's where people are protected, the assets they rely on are protected and safe from harm. It's one that's healthy, where people are healthy, but the environment that they rely on is also healthy. It's one that is inclusive, targeting and reaching the most vulnerable and marginalized communities as well. And it's one that's also prepared. It's one that's prepared to minimize risk, to prevent risk, to adapt, absorb, respond to, and recover from hazard impacts if they were to occur. The Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative is structured around 10 essentials for making cities resilient. Essentials 1 to 3 looks at the governance and financial aspects. Essentials 4 look at your urban planning, your land use zoning. Essential 5 speaks to your ecosystem services and protection of these services. Essential 6 speaks to your institutional capacities across sectors and across agencies. Essential 7 looks at your societal capacity and the integration of community and grassroots mechanisms and the most vulnerable and planning for these groups as well. Essential 8 looks at your infrastructure resilience, so your critical infrastructure such as health, transport, telecommunications, water, sanitation, and so on. And Essentials 9 and 10 look at your response and recovery aspect. There are 3 core areas that cut across these 10 essentials, and they include that social integration, resilience, and connecting the national and global instruments to the very local levels. Under MCR 2030, there's a suite of tools and methodologies that local areas can apply to develop their local resilience strategies. The primary tool is the Disaster Resilience Scorecard, and it allows local areas to assess their capacities and challenges around these 10 essentials. Ultimately, it supports these areas in developing their local resilience plans. What is particularly valuable, please, Shal, we can go on. what is particularly valuable with MCR 2030 is that it responds to those needs at a very local level and supports resilience planning in thematic areas at this local level. And so responding to these needs have given rise to the development of several addendums to this primary scorecard that facilitates that very detailed planning. And these include displacement, multi-hazard early warning systems, gender equality, food systems resilience, cultural heritage, public health, the inclusion of persons with disabilities, climate resilience, and other tools co-developed with the business community. Under this current joint program funded by the United Nations Trust Fund for Human Security and undertaken jointly with IOM and other partners, we are working with local areas in the Caribbean, and sometimes these are cities and districts or parishes. It all depends to apply some of these tools. Apart from the disaster resilience scorecard, which is the core tool, we're also applying the displacement addendum, and Viola would have touched on the need for planning for human mobility. What we are doing is supporting local areas in preventing disaster risk where it can be prevented, minimizing it so the risk of displacement is also reduced, but also if displacement does occur, it does so in a safe and dignified manner to those affected directly and also to host communities. In the same way, we are applying the multi-hazard early warning systems addendum to prevent and minimize losses associated with these hazard events, and so promoting anticipatory action among local communities. We can already see here, and I'm sorry that I jumped ahead of Kana in this way, because the linkages would have come out a bit more clearly in terms of how the human security approach is supported through MCR 2030. But I'm sure when Kana gives a presentation, you'd see this a bit more. There are 5 core principles of the human security approach, and MCR 2030 embodies these principles. MCR 2030 is people-centered in that it connects people with policy. It gives local communities a voice in determining what should be resilience actions for their area. And it takes into consideration those social circumstances, capacities, and challenges faced among communities. It's comprehensive in that it calls for a coordinated and systems approach to planning. And you can see that across the 10 essentials, looking at resilience more than just disaster risk reduction response or recovery, but looking at the financing, the governance, the urban planning, the environmental protection, the social integration, and community resilience aspects as well. MCR 2030 is also context specific in that it goes local and translates those global instruments such as the Sendai framework, the SDGs, and the Early Warning for All initiative to the very local level where people are and where communities exist. And it takes into consideration those specific unique circumstances of local areas. It's prevention oriented in that it aims to inform the development of local resilience action plan that ultimately seek to prevent risk where they can be prevented or to minimize them. So ultimately lives are protected and livelihoods are secured. It's also protection and empowerment based because it promotes the empowerment of local governments, the communities they serve, and the people within these communities. And these are those at the very heart of disaster risk. MCR 2030 adopts a multi-hazard approach, and in doing so, it addresses the varying threats to human security, which include environmental insecurity, food insecurity, health insecurity, and more. And we can see these not just by the tools and addendums of MCR 2030, but if you were to take a look at these, you'd see them also by the assessment criteria within these tools. We see that the MCR 2030 is a strong example of how the human security approach can be mainstreamed in already existing initiatives within the Caribbean region. I thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing your feedback and your experiences and taking your questions later on. Thank you, Dr. Henry. Over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Indeed, and I think your presentation fit quite nicely in the whole concept of discussion on how cities, communities, other agencies beyond international organizations and governments, the kinds of roles that they can play in seeking to build the resilience within those agencies, within the communities and and cities. So I think this really adds value to the conversation we've been having this morning at this particular webinar discussion. And certainly we do hope to hear from those who have logged in terms of their own perspectives, sharing their own experiences and asking thought-provoking questions on how we move forward with implementing these kinds of initiatives. So thank you very much for your presentation, Ms. Lewis. So are we able to move to Ms. Kudo just to verify that she's been able to join us? If not, we can take...
John.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, Miss Kudo. Okay.
Hi, Ms. Kudo.
Hello.
Oh,
Sorry about the delay. Sorry, just the time
we've
difference
missed you
setting
just
was
now.
a little bit different.
We've missed you just now, but it's really happy that we can now hear from you. And so
Thank you very much.
without further ado, we would want to invite you, Ms. Kudo,
Yes.
to speak on the human security approach for resilience and sustainable development. As I indicated earlier, Ms. Kudo is the Program Management Officer for the UN Trust Fund for Human Security. So, Ms. Kudo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and sincere apologies again for being late for the webinar. Again, that there was a setting for my laptop. It's a little bit, I think, different for the time difference or something. But anyway, so just let me jump onto the presentation. So again, what is human security? So if you hear the word security, you must instantly think about maybe national security or territorial security, something to do with the country or the place that you live in. So that's the state security, that's how it started. But, of course, state security is very important when the country is at war. Of course, you don't really you don't enjoy maybe the way you live, or, your well-being is definitely affected. But is the national security is the only important security? I think the simple answer is no, because, yes, the country needs to be safe and secured, but at the same time, you yourself also needs to be feeling that you are safe and also secure. So survival, livelihoods, and dignity of people are very important for, and that's what we call human security in general. And that also comes in the complementarity of the state security, because again, national security and human security comes hand in hand, because we both have to have the security for both ways. So human security, in a sense, was a big paradigm shift, because we always talked about this national security in history. So now we are putting more, people-centered, or just putting the people as a first as a core of the security. So we place the individual as the referent object of security, and that's a fundamental shift from the national security to human security. And human security also allows for broader examination of factors typically peripheral to security. It also deepens the relationship between state security and the security of people. It recognizes threats and insecurities are interconnected. It recognizes the need for the broad range of actors and aims for multi-sector, comprehensive, and integrated solutions. And it focuses on the long term with a view towards prevention. So the prevention is also key for human security. So how it started was, as you have seen from the video, and so it was adopted by the General Assembly, and so on September 10th, 2012, and that was a significant milestone for the application of human security. The General Assembly at the time agreed by consensus that human security is an approach to assist member states in identifying and addressing widespread and cross-cutting challenges to the survival, livelihood, and dignity of their people. And based on this, the General Assembly endorsed the common understanding to guide the application of human security approach within the United Nations. And so maybe you can go to the next presentation. So in a simple language, so human security is an operational framework, and that has a focus on people-centered, comprehensive, context-specific, and prevention-oriented. And human security always have to human security will help protect and empower people, and particularly people in a vulnerable situation. And I just have to also reiterate that the right of people to live in freedom and dignity, free from poverty and despair. That is the how human security helps all individuals, in particular vulnerable people, and are entitled to freedom from fear and freedom from want, with an equal opportunity to enjoy all their rights and fully develop their human potential. So that's the very fundamental of human security. And so you can go to the next slide. So how human security helps? So human security has components of it's a combination of different insecurities, different security. So that's with the political security. So what is political security? So political security is political repression, human rights abuses, lack of rule of law. So these are so human beings or humanity are protected from political security. That is also important. And of course, you have to think about economic security. That includes poverty, unemployment, lack of access to economic opportunities. You also have food security, which I think in the UN system and also globally, we talk about a lot nowadays. So food security includes hunger, famine, sudden change in food availability and prices. That is also the important issue that we think about when we talk about food security. Also, that covers health security, epidemics, malnutrition, poor sanitation, lack of access to healthcare. That is also critical for us to live and lead a happy life. That again also discuss about environmental security, environmental degradation, resource depletion, natural disasters. And I think your program really touches upon the environmental security. Of course, most of them, others as well, but environmental security the most. And that also talks about the personal security, physical violence, human trafficking, child labor, and so on. And of course, we have to think about community security as well. There's inter-ethnic, religious, identity-based tensions, crime, and terrorism. So if the vulnerable populations are most of the time suffering in a very unlivable conditions, and sometimes they are that they have many multiple insecurities affected for their well-being and also for their lives. So that's why human security is important, not only just to talk about political security only, but instead we try to tackle all these insecurities all together, so that again the vulnerable people and the people are really somehow having the better lives and better living conditions. So that's again is the fundamental of the human security. And so now I want to talk a little bit about how your program is contributing and how human security is going to be a useful approach for your program, particularly in addressing insecurities of vulnerable communities, including disaster-placed persons and environmental migrants. So again, human security has a people-centered approach as one of the fundamentals. But it's people-centered approach. It is to talk about the rights of vulnerable populations, and they should be always placed at the center of program. In line with the human security approach, the development of national and regional frameworks will be enhanced and enhance the empowerment and protection of vulnerable groups for multiple threats. So particularly this program, or your program, develops a shared objective as starting point for intergovernmental discussion while placing people, including both displaced people and also receiving communities, at the heart of interventions. It also considers all the public services and support that are needed for a person. Also, with a focus on vulnerable populations, particularly children, people with disabilities, and indigenous groups, your program develops multi-hazard preparedness plans and strategies to address the climate and disaster-related challenges faced by them. So, yes, thank you very much. So next slide. So your program, we consider it's very context specific, and considering the specific context, even beyond territorial boundaries, including the root causes of insecurities and their interlinkages, allowing for more integrated, effective, and sustainable responses. So how you're applying this context-specific approach in this program is, your program is assessing and understanding displacement trends and overall human mobility dynamics in the region through Caribbean migration consultations and any other consultations that you're going to be working on. And this mechanism could eventually help develop concrete and practical policy and programmatic guidance that enhance the region's of overall preparedness and response capacity to these challenges. So that's why, it's very, we consider this program is very useful because it talks about, different contexts in different islands, different communities, and we try not to use this just fit for all approach, but instead we try to tackle the issues or root causes for specific communities, different communities in a different manner, in a more sustainable and effective manner. And maybe you can go to the next slide. So we also consider this program is using prevention-oriented manner very well. The program focuses, so what the prevention-oriented approach means is that it focuses efforts to prevent or mitigate risks. It advances locally tailored responses to protect and empower individuals and communities in coping with these risks, and strengthens early warning mechanisms that enhance resilience and whatever possible to prevent the occurrence of crisis. So this program focuses on resilience building by supporting persons and communities affected by natural hazards and developing proactive and participatory planning for mass cross-border evacuation and prevention strategies to potentially reduce the drivers of forced migration. So this is very key, to talk about the reduce the drivers of forced migration, for instance, because this is more like forward-looking rather than, you react after something happened. So that is very key, and that is very important approach. And also this program ensures that within the development of national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, displacement consideration will be integrated into strategic documents, while also incorporating multi-hazard early warning systems to reduce the number of potentially displaced people. So this is, again, we are trying to do the forward-looking processes. It's key, and it's going to be very useful. So that's why, this program is very human security oriented, and we want to see how this program moves forward. So thank you very much, and I think my presentation is it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Kudo. In fact, I was about to say to keep your slide up so that we could just quickly go back to slide 6, which really, I think, gave a very good overview of the dimensions of the human security approach. I'm really encapsulating everything that we appreciate to be aspects of our security: political security, community security, personal security, environmental security, which of course we've been unpacking during the course of this webinar just now. And then of course you have the health security, food security, and of course very critical to a lot of persons, the economic security. So I think it is really a significant aspect to how we treat with the issue of development broadly in examining human security as a very significant component of this. So I want to thank you very much for your presentation. Certainly, we do look forward to questions coming your way. I have a couple questions for you as well, so that we can certainly continue the conversation on the issues of human security. Thanks again, Ms.
Thank you.
Kudo, and I want to take the opportunity now to transition the discussion to two colleagues who will explore and certainly provide details on country-specific experiences that certainly can inform not just what we've been talking about in terms of this existing project, but also future projects and other initiatives. The order of the disaster would suggest that perhaps Mr. Mussington might be best to speak first, given the impact was 2017, and Ms. Forbes would speak on the sort of 2024 and 2021 disaster. So, Mr. Mussington, happy to have you, and certainly looking forward to your presentation. Mr. Mussington is an educator and a community representative in Antigua and Barbuda, particularly Barbuda, and he certainly will be speaking on the practical experiences and lessons learned coming out of the impact of Hurricane Irma. And if, you know, just not to take anything from Mr. Mussington's presentation, but if you recall, the entire population of Barbuda had to be relocated to the mainland Antigua following the impact of Hurricane Irma. So without further ado, I want to pass on the floor to you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. And it's indeed a pleasure to be here this morning, and greetings everyone who are participating in this presentation today. Now, in order to give context to my response to two particular questions that will be the focus of my presentation, let me first provide some background on my experiences. The first hurricane which I lived through as an adult was Hurricane Hugo around 1989, if my memory serves me correctly. Then the next significant event was Hurricane Lewis a few years later in 1995. This was a major disaster on the level of Irma in terms of its impact. From 1995, things escalated considerably with multiple storms and hurricanes each year, to such a level that a USAID-funded initiative called the OECS Post-Georges Mitigation Project, which set out to chart the course for communities in the OECS if they were to continue to exist in what was to become this new paradigm, where disaster caused by extreme weather were the norm. Then in 2017, there was Hurricane Irma, which raised the bar and set the new standard for what is now the new norm. So the perspective I bring to the table today is based on experience gained from having lived through over 30 years of the harsh realities of existence on a small, flat island, fully exposed to the consequences of the climate crisis. For me and other Barbudans, it has not been a theoretical or academic exercise. This is real day-to-day life. Local governance represents and serves the needs of local communities. The members of the community are the clients, which are the recipients of response efforts after major disasters like Irma. They therefore must be the focus of any recovery and rebuilding efforts after these disasters. Therefore, the inclusion in the process of planning is absolutely essential. You cannot do anything without including those who are the targets of any resilience or recovery effort. Now, by excluding local government, the target for any rebuilding effort will not adequately be represented, and so the results will not serve the community's best interests. I raise this point because I've seen the consequences of not including the communities that are affected to play a part in the decision-making process. The second question has to do with the gaps in early warning systems. I think in the case of Barbuda, the system worked well. We had years of experience in disaster response, so every household, every Barbudan was reasonably well versed in preparation and how to utilize the warning systems in informing such preparations. That is one of the reasons why we survived Irma. The failures we experience in recovery are due to the community being excluded from the process of recovery and rebuilding. The early warning system works, and my only suggestion in terms of improvement would be to speed up the process of providing us with the facilities to house the foundations of certain aspects of this system, namely a disaster storage and operational center equipped with all the necessary tools to allow the persons that manage such a system on the ground to function efficiently. Now, those are my responses, and I just want to take this opportunity to say that what I was prepared to say and the conviction with which I'm saying it was before having heard Miss Alana Lewis and the last speaker in terms of their whole exposition on the concept of human security principles. And that MCR 2030 makes me even more convinced now that we have to bear in mind that if any of this is going to work, you cannot exclude the people. You cannot exclude local governance structures. The whole concept of human security, based on what I've heard this morning, our security, my security, is worse off today than it was prior to the 2017 disaster. And some of the things that I'm hearing now coming out in this concept, I want to put on the table that in an effort to address this whole question of human security, agencies must take into consideration the whole concept of disaster capitalism. It is a reality. And I think one of the main reasons such systems will not work is if players, wealthy players, are allowed to take over the machinery of governments. They can have influence in terms of determining the outcome after any disaster. And so disasters now can be used as a tool to basically force the relocation of peoples, put persons and communities in situations where their human security is at definite risk. And I'm not talking theoretical here because these are things that are happening, for example, in Honduras, where recently in Washington, just last week, there was a hearing before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where a community, the Crayfish Rock community, was before that commission in a hearing, basically putting their case, which is all about security, human security, and what they are facing in terms of the risk of having to relocate because of a player, a conglomerate, which the Honduras government signed on an agreement to. And that hearing was about exclusive economic zones and the kind of secret agreements which governments enter into, which will seriously impact human security, especially in situations where disasters kind of tip the circumstances where advantage can be taken of communities and people. The reality is, these gems that we live on these islands, these bits of paradise, the mineral wealth, lithium and so on, that most of these forests and forest projects and so on represents in Latin America and the Caribbean, that notion of disaster capitalism has to be put into context and included in these discussions that we're having today in terms of how we build resilient communities and how we ensure human security following those principles that were so ably outlined by the two previous speakers before me. So I rest there. And once again, thank you for the opportunity. and I look forward to discussing any points which I've raised today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mussington. I must say that the central takeaway here is that you really cannot build resilient communities without putting at the center, at its core, the full involvement of the persons who are most to be impacted by those decisions. Thank you very, very much for that. So I now want to turn attention to our last speaker for this morning, this afternoon, and that is Michelle Forbes, who is, as I said earlier, the director of the National Emergency Management Organization in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I see her presentation is already up. And so without further ado, Michelle, I think I want to pass on to you to make your presentation. I'm not sure that your camera is working, just to indicate, Michelle, but certainly you can proceed with your presentation.
I hope we save the best for last. So I'm going to present today, giving St. Vincent and the Grenadines context in terms of the several hazards impact we have had over the years. And on my first slide, you will see the multiplicity of hazards that have impacted St. Vincent and the Grenadines, let's say in the last 5 years. And while we tend to focus on the natural hazards, our slide clearly shows the health impacts of the health hazards also that we have faced, the dengue epidemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and we must also remember the last volcanic eruption in 2021. We were in the throes of the pandemic. And of course, we have been dealt quite a blow this year, early in the hurricane season, with the major hurricane Beryl that impacted St. Vincent and Grenadines and decimated our southern Grenadines islands of Union Island, Mairo, Kana, St. Vincent, and Palm Island, those two resort islands. So in this context, the whole multi-hazard environment and multi-hazard early warning, being able to communicate to our population, especially during these times, and actually look at the human mobility and security issues. Next. So we know this hurricane season was forecasted to be a bad one, and we saw the early system coming in. And those two photos really just show you the season outlook for 2024. And the first photo on the left showed persons trying to evacuate from Union Island post-impact peril. And on the right, we have the volcanic eruption. And of course, persons now being evacuated via the Coast Guard along the East Coast following the eruption because they refused to move when the evacuation order was given. So I'm going to use these two examples, these two particular hazards, to really show some of the similarities and differences. Now, in looking at the last two, and we're looking at the multi-hazard early warning context from the monitoring, the science, and I like to focus on the science a bit and what happened in both events. For the last two volcanic eruption, it gave us a few months. It could have gone bang in December 2020, but it didn't. It gave us a few months to really look at our planning and prevent planning. We would have updated the national plan in 2016, 2017 with collaboration from the Red Cross and PIRAC, local Red Cross PIRAC. And we would have actually tested this plan in 2019 during the trade wind exercise. And we had a long program of what we call volcanic science or citizen science, where we really did a lot of work on the community. And this paid off for us in terms of looking at the multi-hazard early warning context. The early warnings were timely, and also preparing the communities in the event of an evacuation order. We were able to look at the hazard zones. I know a lot of persons, you see that picture in the middle with the different hazard zones, the red, orange, yellow, and green. And I think that was known throughout the region in terms of our hazard zones for St. Vincent. You knew where you were. And you know the top half of the mainland St. Vincent had to evacuate southward. So there was no questioning or him and hawing about that. You know that from that top of the island, you had to move southward. Of course, in a hurricane, it's different. So in this context, we're able to plan some of the human mobility issues in knowing if you are from Fancy in the north, that most of your community, you are going to move, you're assigned to, for example, emergency shelters in Calico in the south. So persons already knew that. And you can see the volcanic hazard maps behind me too. So the persons and community members already had an idea where they were going if they needed to seek public shelter. And when we're looking at human mobility, we know that some of the public shelters are not really suitable also for persons. We encourage in our discussion, in our speaking with the communities, we really encourage them to also find families and friends they can stay with to reduce some of the security issues and other human issues you would find in public shelters. Next. Let's look at major hurricane Beryl. When a hurricane is approaching, everybody is at risk. In terms of the volcano, you had the northern part of the island, and this is an island-wide impact. And we must remember, in our context, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 32 island and cays, and we have 7, 8 inhabited islands stretching south just north of Grenada. So commuting and accessing to some of these communities can be difficult because they're different islands. In this context, whereas in the volcanic eruption, we had 23,400 people roughly displaced. In the Hurricane Beryl, we had 3,000 households being displaced. We still have persons in emergency shelters, 500 persons in emergency shelters and public shelters, and we have another 900 persons in rental or guest homes accommodation. And I want to highlight this here because we did this the first time in placing persons in guest houses, and in particular in 2021, when the volcano started to act up, as we say, in December 2020. One of the things that my minister said, Michelle, this is 2020. This is not 1979 when we had a last eruption. The conditions in the shelters in terms of the human security issues are not the same. We cannot put elderly persons. We have to look at the pregnant lactating mothers. We have to look at young children. Can we find alternate accommodation for these folks and these vulnerable population? And we had the Ministry of Tourism coming on board to lead that process in terms of finding access to housing, in terms of the rentals and also guest houses. And we employed the same strategy in 2024, post-burial, though we didn't have the arrangement before. And this is one of the things we have to look at in terms of improving our MOUs and arrangements to cater for persons who will be displaced. So what have we learned? Because I know we have a very short time. What have we learned during this time? And I know the writing might be small. We look at resource mobilization post-emergency, and I do have a pet peeve with when we talk about disaster, it's financing and anticipatory financing. What are we anticipating? Are you seeing it? And we talk about it a lot, but we're not seeing the anticipation in terms of financing. You're still grappling for resources to plan, to prepare the communities, to do public education, informing persons. We wait until, and many of the agencies are listening, you wait until something happens to say, hey, I'm giving you something, when the countries already have been planning, and they cannot get some of the support that they need. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines context, we are centralized government. We really do not have the local government structures throughout the island. And this crippled us to some extent, in particular with the Hurricane Beryl, because we had the Southern Grenadine Island. Yes, we have volunteer committees on these islands, but you need more than that. And while we had a community structure and so on, they too were overwhelmed, and really and truly they were just overwhelmed, and they still came out and tried their best. But we really need to look at how do we decentralize some of our functions of government to the communities, especially when you have smaller islands that you're working with and are just as vulnerable. Excuse me. We have to plan for the long haul, and these are some of the same lessons that we are learning from the volcanic eruption. We have to plan for the long haul, and even now, as we're getting close to Christmas, there's a false sense of security. How do we manage expectations that I am going to get back into my house that is gone by Christmas? And we're looking at some of the human issues. This is where you're going to see the depression and suicidal increases in persons being suicidal coming in. We're already getting a few reports of those. So we have to plan for the long haul. You look at the emergency activation in terms of our countries, in terms of our disaster offices, because I'm speaking from a disaster office. And I'll give you this context. In the pandemic in 2020, we were activated to support the Ministry of Health in the COVID pandemic. We actually activated the National Emergency Operations Center on the 14th of March 2020. And we stood down that activation a week before the volcanic eruption. I think my folks at the Ministry of Health were mad with me then, because I was speaking to the scientists, so I knew that the volcano was going to go bang at some point. So I know I had to prepare for another emergency and planning to transition in to prepare for the volcano. So we had, but we have been going for almost 4 years. And we have to look at the whole human factors in terms of persons involved in emergency management also, if we're looking at human security part of it. Now, we need to look at the multiple scenarios. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a perfect example. We have had, I said before, we have had the dengue, we have had the COVID-19 pandemic, we had Hurricane Elsa in 2021, we had the Lahars, we had flash flooding, we have Hurricane Beryl this year, we have had one of the wettest Novembers on record here in St. Vincent, especially one of few days. And we have had all the landslides and everything that you can talk about. So, and people are being displaced in all of these events, not just the big events, every event people are being displaced. And when we look at the socioeconomic context and the human mobility and security, the dignity of persons, are the shelters fit for purpose that we're currently using, how we're going to improve some of these issues, and in terms of including the social protection programs that we need to see that persons are stepping out of the poverty and being a bit more secure. I like to use the context that follow the science, and my staff tend to say to me that I'm a little bit, it's not that I forecast anything. In the first week of June, we were actually in Union Island in the Southern Grenadines doing our hurricane awareness campaign. It wasn't well received, and 3 weeks later, bang. But I said to them, we needed to focus on the Southern Grenadines. And it's not that I had any hindsight or seeing things as the people would say. It's just that the science over the last few years has shown some systems dipping rather south. And I was concerned that we needed to pay a bit more attention to the Southern Grenadines. And that is what is, looking at the science and how we need to inform our communities a little bit better. And of course, the impact on the economy is far-reaching. What have we learned? The livelihoods have been decimated in the Southern Grenadines. Tourism, they're built on tourism. How do we get them back up? What is government support for some of these areas? Can the government support? Can the government do it all? So some of these things that we need to look at. And in terms of collaboration, what we have learned, the regional coordination is excellent. We need to continue to do that regional coordination, and because we bring different tools to the table, different strengths, different capacities to the region, and that is what keeps us through managing some of these emergencies. In terms of data management tools, that's one thing I use, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, that we saw all of these things emerging. We actually were able to implement some of them during the 2024 season with our screens and our impact base and our data tools showing our overview of the impact and what was happening in different communities. And we have also learned that the building codes can work. That building that you see there on the right is one of our satellite warehouses that we built in Union Island a few years ago. Actually opened it in 2020, and 4 years later it stood the test. So building codes can work for major category hurricane, and that was one of the few standing buildings that remained in Union Island. Next, thanks. Okay, I think there's an old, but I made a few changes to these slides, but anyway, no, we can go to the left. That's okay. Let's look at the way forward in terms of looking at disaster risk management in general and the human mobility issues that we will find. Our strengthening of our national disaster management plans have to include our islands. We did not have an evacuation procedure for Union Island, like how Barbuda had to evacuate the island. We did not have that in plan. We had it for the volcanic eruption because we knew we had to move people south, but we didn't think that we really had to move persons off an island. So we need to look at our not our plans, but our legal framework that we can activate and include evacuation planning. We have to look at our ICT. We talk about ICT a lot and it's getting better and so on. But we were crippled to some extent also with our communications post-burial. What worked for us is part of our emergency communication network that we would have installed a few years ago. In terms of our radios, we were able to reach some parts of Union Island, and where the antenna was damaged, we couldn't reach that area, but we were able to reach most part of Union Island via our radio. And when we got on the ground, we could have used it, but other than that, you had no communication whatsoever. So from about 11 o'clock on the Monday morning, we had no communication with Union Island. So we were just operating blind. And when we saw, imagine your feeling when you saw that iron wall moving over Union Island, and you're there just staring like knowing that the impact is going to be on the island. One of the things we see coming out and security is the coordination of all our relief players, whether it's in human security. Otherwise, we're having some challenges, and persons, agencies want to just go and visit the shelters without communicating with us, publishing assessments, and it hasn't been cleared through the disaster office or the ministries that have the lead in some of these sectors. We need to have some better coordination when we look at some of these human security issues. Because when you put out some information, say X number of persons have been raped in a shelter, for example, and so on, without even knowing how you coin that, people might think that it's a widespread occurrence, but you do have some of the issues arising in terms of security issues, but we need to be better at coordinating and following, having some laws and some protocols that governs how we communicate and how do we coordinate with each other in an emergency in particular. What can I say about the last one in terms of our way forward? Community resilience is key. Intersectoral coordination. We have seen the impact in Union Island. We have seen the impact in the northern part of the island. The need for more community engagement, community coordination, building that community resilience, not at the central government level, but throughout the community, so they too can have that capacity to build. One of my community members in Union Island, he came through yesterday and he said, I keep saying to people, I don't know what Michelle was preparing me for, what Nemo was preparing me for, but the training that you all had given us over the years is what helped us. And now I'm in the seat and I said, I don't know how you make it. And we don't know how we make it, but we know we go through it all. But human security and human mobility is becoming increasingly placed on the forefront. In our context, we have the internal displacement, but we also have had some external displacement from Maria in 2017, where we had persons, our residents returning from Dominica, from British Virgin Islands, Marquise, and so on. So we are seeing some of more human mobility issues, and we really need to have some clear guidelines and procedures to govern how do we address some more of the regional migration, not so much internal, the state deals with that, but more of the regional migration internal and coming in back into your country. So with that presentation, I want to thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Michelle. As expected, you touched on so many aspects, and in fact, I think you certainly helped me to zero in on what my final comments for this webinar would be. But certainly, we're very thankful for your presentation, and I think at this point we would want to invite all to provide questions to our panelists. I have been checking the comment section. I haven't seen anything come in, but certainly we invite you to ask some questions. But in the interim, I think I will use my role as moderator to pose a couple of questions that I think would be very critical. So if I may start quickly with Mrs. Pascal. So you spoke about the importance of multi-hazards and early warning systems. I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts on how multi-hazard early warning systems can really address human mobility issues, addressing the challenges for vulnerable communities, especially in our region, Caribbean.
Okay, Dr. Henry, thank you for that question.
Keep
I
your
have
response
our,
shortly, if I may also ask me.
sorry?
Keep your response shortly or brief. In the
No,
interest
I'm gonna hand over my question to our implementing partner, Pete from Platform on Disaster Displacement, Dr. Juan Carlos. I think he's online. So let me just give him the spotlight.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Happy to step in, Viola. Yeah, I
I
can
was
take that
supposed to be
question.
celebrating something. I heard Dr. Juan Carlos. I haven't heard that before in many, many years that we collaborated. So I suspect if that's the case, you would need to send me, a ticket to Geneva, and we can have some a good evening of wine.
Thank you, Clarence. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's always a pleasure for the PDD to be part of these virtual events. And since 2021, it's been an honor to be part of this UN Trust Fund on Human Security Program. And that is the question that you had for Viola, Clarence, is actually a good one, with many ways to looking at it. Multi-hazard early warning systems are critical, as you already know, tools for addressing the challenges of human mobility. And as someone explained at the beginning of the session, when we talk about human mobility, we're talking about migration, planned relocation, which is really hard sometimes to understand. We just heard some not so good practices from Mr. Mussington, and displacement, especially in vulnerable communities in the Caribbean, which are highly prone to disasters, as everyone knows. Looking at the pillar warning, dissemination, and communication, many times following an impact, the reaction of the public is that we did not know this was going to happen, or they didn't tell us. And while this may be true in some instances, in others, it's a simple coping mechanism, as the disaster system would have indeed provided information. But we must recognize that an effective warning and feedback system can support disaster personnel, first responders, and community volunteers in having an effective evacuation system and in dealing with the difficult part of getting people to move out of harm's way. In fact, evacuation is a form of forced displacement, most times temporarily, as we just heard from Mrs. Forbes. And on the other hand, disaster risk knowledge in this management is a foundational pillar, and it's critical to inform decision making. Finally, in the interest of time, here's how early warning systems can help mitigate these challenges, just 4 short points. First, improved preparedness and anticipatory action, timely alerts. We know that the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, DCTIMA, has worked to strengthen early warning systems across the Caribbean. Second, reducing the need for spontaneous unsafe mobility by controlling relocation plans. I think Mr. Mussington has plenty to say about that. And of course, when it comes to cross-border mobility, this is in the interest of the PDD, facilitating cross-border mobility through regional coordination. And we have plenty examples in the region. And finally, supporting post-disaster recovery and reintegration. After a disaster, early warning systems can provide information on when it is safe for displaced communities to return to their homes or move to more sustainable locations. This is crucial for communities that may face prolonged displacement or may decide to settle in new areas, either temporarily or permanently. So in conclusion, I would say that multi-hazard early warning systems can reduce human mobility challenges by providing timely alerts, enabling preventive relocation plans, offering targeted support for the most vulnerable, facilitating regional cooperation, and ensuring smoother post-disaster recovery. And I'll stop here. Back to you, Clarence. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Juan Carlos, for this, and Mrs. Pascal as well. There is one question being asked on the chat. I think I will, actually two questions. I will return to these two questions very quickly. I wanted to invite Alana very quickly and ask whether she can explore further how the MCR 2030 initiative are expected to help cities, especially in the Caribbean region, in addressing human mobility concerns, particularly in post-disaster arrangements.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Henry. Let me start by saying that with climate change projected to increase our risk profiles, what we expect to see is a lot of internal displacement happening, so that rural to urban migration happening as persons are in search of better livelihoods as well. Cities are therefore at the forefront, but I also want to make the point that it's not just cities, it can be the local and rural areas as well, the districts, the parishes. MCR 2030 is prevention oriented. So it aims to support areas and developing that local disaster risk reduction strategy and action plan so that where risk can be prevented so that displacement does not happen. That's the approach. And in the event that displacement happens, it's done so in a safe and dignified manner so that one, the displaced persons are safe and cared for. And we heard Ms. Forbes speaking about the conditions in shelters. Secondly, as Mr. Mussington pointed out, that the displacement affected population, which includes the host communities as well as those directly displaced, are involved in the planning aspect. And also we have the tools, those specific tools such as the displacement addendum under the MCR 2030 initiative that allows that targeted planning in these areas. It deals with the response and recovery aspects, so of course the shelters and rebuilding and resettlement, but it also looks at the prevention and preparedness aspects as well. So it takes displacement from those lens, not just of the disaster preparedness, the disaster risk management cycle, I should say, but also across the 10 essentials. We've seen this happen recently in Antigua and Barbuda, where we applied the displacement addendum in addition to these other tools. And we saw some key challenges coming up with regards to reaching displaced persons, mapping of displaced persons from many years ago, all the way from Montserrat to even the internally displaced between Antigua and Barbuda. We also saw the issues of language and translations needed to reach those communities from different countries. For example, there are a lot of growing populations from China and Spanish-speaking communities of the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic. So how do we target these persons so that we plan in an inclusive manner? So these are just some of the examples of how MCR supports the local resilience planning, taking that preventative approach, but also addressing the different phases of displacement and looking at managing displacement and human mobility at large in a context that it's safe and dignified and prevented where it can be.
Yeah, certainly. You know, you always hear prevention is better than cure. And certainly even in the context of environmental hazards, this is certainly applicable. So thanks for that, Alana. So Kana, if I may quickly ask you, in terms of strategies being implemented to enhance the embedding of the human security approach in disaster risk reduction frameworks, can you speak to how or speak to those strategies that are most effective in doing so?
Sure, thank you very much. So we have for the trust fund, we have quite a few disaster risk reduction focus programs that we have already supported. And most of the time, I think, you know, since disaster risk reduction is a very, it touches upon the vulnerable populations, and also they are, again, faced with not just the environmental security, but also food security and political security and many other insecurities at the same time. So I think what I can say is that the most effective one is just really the strategy that try to focus on not just for the, again, political assessment, for instance, or the one specific assessment, but instead incorporating so many other insecurities as a whole. And when we when they do that, it's very important to include many other stakeholders, not just only the government stakeholders, but also people from the communities, vulnerable communities, specific target populations, like you said, the people with disabilities, youth, for instance. That is also very important, when we do that, like assessment, validation of the data, information collected, and also just moving forward, with the recommendations based on the assessment. So I think what I can share with you some of the examples that we have done with, like, for instance, in Kenya, they developed, for instance, the resource mobilization committee that, really really assess what's happening, what is the issue, for instance, and then with the resource available at the time, they can also make the recommendation based on the data collected and also the amount of available fund, for instance, for them. We have also a few other examples from different countries. I mean, when we have, time, and I can also share with you the website link. So maybe you can take a look at what kind of disaster risk reduction programs or strategy that other trust fund programs have developed and how that has been affected as well. I hope that answer that in a very brief manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Kana. We do appreciate you being brief. No, it's certainly, I think, this webinar is really also about sharing the good information to all, not just those who have logged into the webinar, but I'm sure persons who will take the opportunity to revisit the webinar at some point. Surely whatever can be shared should be shared. Increasing the knowledge, I think, is critical. There's a note here from UNDRR, which indicates that CDIMA participating states have received support in situational analysis. And certainly, this has really helped to better understand the gaps within the DRR landscape. So we factor for that. I think this contributes certainly to enhancing the capacity of countries in addressing disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation towards building their resilience and achieving sustainable development. So thanks for this, UNDRR. There's the question in the chat. I want to pose this question to you, Michelle, primarily because you didn't mention an aspect of it. So the question is, how much work is being done to support, and of course, I do also welcome other panelists as well to weigh in on the question. How much work is being done to support, advance, and lobby for improved and new legislation needs required to govern disaster management planning procedures and government authorities' oversight? In the Caribbean, the culture and the behavior are very slow by states to pass and amend laws generally. We must improve this critically to meet these urgent needs of climate disasters and in general sustainable development, etc. So it's a mouthful, but if you can weigh in maybe from this St. Vincent context on this question, and I then after also invite other panelists as well to weigh in.
There have been some efforts in terms of improving legislation and legislative framework around disaster risk reduction, climate change. And we saw when the CDIMA would have had the model legislation a few years ago that countries can adapt. Our legislation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines came into effect on the 1st of June 2006. And it's almost 20 years later, 18 years later. We are now in the process of actually going through working with the CDB on updating our legislation, and we've been trying for a few years. It's not a topic that easily attracts funding to, and you need specialists especially to do the work. We have seen some changes in the landscape, in the Caribbean landscape, in terms of where we need to go in terms of legislation, especially in the area of coordination of relief and the IDRL, what we call International Disaster Relief, with the Red Cross. And they have been spearheading that. So we have, over the last year in particular, we have been doing a lot of work looking at the relief coordination and look at that part of it with the Red Cross, CDIMA, and Sedema. So it's a bit slow. I think it's a bit slow. You don't always get that traction for legislative framework, and it depends also on the national legislative agenda. But what we are trying to do, what we are trying in our context, before we even drafted anything, we met with the Attorney General and his team to let them know this is the path we want to go. We shared the model legislation with them. So for 2025, we want to really update it, but it tends to be slow. It's not fast catching, but I want to use the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. How quickly did we get some of those legislation change? Overnight. And yet we are dragging our feet on legislation for climate change, disaster risk reduction, and putting that legislation framework and strengthening the disaster office and the agencies that will have to administer functions, whether it's the planning laws, the building codes, etc. We're dragging our feet on them to some extent because it's not a sexy topic to find funding for, but yet we can change it overnight for certain aspects. I think that's where I'll end.
Thank you, Michelle. And I'm certain that this is an avenue for our development partners to come in and lend some greater support in addressing some of the financing gaps that might exist in doing some of those things. I think, as Michelle pointed out, advancing legislation is not sexy necessarily, but it's also a costly initiative by governments, and one has to weigh in the immediate needs of economic and social, benefits provided by government to people versus that of also very critically issues around strengthening legal frameworks. But nonetheless, they both are very critical and important, and more support in that area would be useful. Any other panelists want to weigh in on this particular question at this point? If not, John, I wanted to ask you quickly, and we note your concerns around how the relocation of citizens from Barbuda to Antigua would have taken place. I wonder whether you can share some thoughts on what can be done to strengthen local government participation in the context of planned relocation and strengthening the ability to respond, the resilience of communities to respond to environmental hazards and climate change.
In answering that question, I think it goes back to the previous issue in terms of legislation and whether or not we need legislation. And I think part of the problem lies in implementation. The fact is, in the Antigua and Barbuda Twin Island situation, there is local government legislation. So the actual legislative framework is in place. Where things seem to go awry is when you have a dissonance between what serves the best interests of community and the policy directives coming out from central government administration. So going forward, there's absolutely a need to have the input of local communities, and you absolutely have to have that involvement of the local government infrastructure, which actually serves the local community. And it's only a question of the willingness of the administration to allow it to happen. What we've seen in the case of Barbuda, it was not allowed to happen. And the reason it was not allowed to happen was basically the difference between recovery and rehabilitation and redevelopment. So the policy decision was taken to redevelop Barbuda entirely in an entirely different direction, which would be facilitated by not having the population there. So that was the decision that was made without the input of the people affected. So it didn't work. It created a lot of problems. And so that's why I'm saying going forward in the ideal situation, you need to have that synergy. You need to have the people-focused approach. None of this will work if you do not have the involvement of the people who are really the clients and who are the targets of all the efforts. Okay? Yes, thank you.
Thanks, John, for that. We certainly running out of time as it were. It has been a very enlightening panel discussion webinar at this point as well. So I'm going to offer to each panelist a one-sentence conclusion. And there's a lot of ones in there. One-sentence conclusion on what would be your main recommendation for integrating human mobility concerns and multi-hazard early warning systems into regional and national development plans. So one sentence, what would be your main recommendation? So perhaps if we can start off with Alana.
Sure, thank you, Dr. Henry. My one sentence would be to leverage the available tools and mechanisms to do so. MCR 2030 is just one of those. There is the multi-hazard early warning systems checklist. There is the early warning for all toolkit, and all of these can help in aiding and assessing capacities and challenges towards planning for resilience action in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana. Kana, what is your one sentence?
I would say people, talking to people, working with people, anything, if you want to do anything with the early warning system, you have to really make sure that people are people are placed at the center of discussion and decision-making processes. And without, as I think as Mr. John just said it, without having people involved from the scratch and from the beginning, there's no way that we can succeed. So that's going to be my recommendation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kana. John, what about you?
For me, I would say my one sentence is to let the human security principles be the focus and let them be the guide in terms of determining any plans and efforts that we make in future.
Thank you. Michelle, what about you?
I would say people-centered, using the tools that we have, but we must be people-centered in our approach to human mobility and security.
Thank you. Viola, I've moved on to you. What's your one
I will say everything that has already been said and leverage the benefits of human mobility. There are benefits there. Leverage the benefits of human mobility. Sorry about that.
Okay, not a problem, but certainly this webinar has been quite enlightening. I want to take the opportunity to thank all our panelists this morning and this afternoon, where you may be, for weighing in on the issues around human mobility and multi-hazard early warning systems, your recommendations, your thoughts and advancing, your own experiences have been well noted throughout this webinar. We want to also thank those who would have taken the time to log in and to be enlightened and enriched during the course of this webinar. Thank you very much for logging in. Please do share the knowledge that would have been gained from this webinar broadly, because that is important. The issues around human mobility, climate change, needs for early warning systems all impact us across the Caribbean and other small island developing states and other bigger developing regions as well. So with that said, thank you very much for tuning in. We do look forward to the next time that we have a webinar of this nature and look forward to you logging in for that as well. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day to everybody. Thank you very much.